Emily was 13 years old. A meager feast and field flowers usually didn't mar her holiday, but the girl was sad this time. She was growing up and well aware of her situation, an orphan living in the care of a stranger's woman. She had to darn and wear her stepmother's old clothes and shoes because there was not even enough money for food. They lived poor in a tiny village. There was no work for the women. Her stepmother, Cindy, raised poultry and took them to the neighboring town to sell. She would go away for a few days because the city was very far away, leaving Emily alone in the house for a few days. Emmy had no girlfriends because there were few children in the village, and they all did strenuous housework. Cindy and Emily barely made ends meet and saved food. Her stepmother would leave Emily food for a few days, but it was usually not enough until Cindy returned from town. During the warmer seasons, Emmy would pick mushrooms and berries in the woods, but there was a catch here too. Their village was at the junction of two forests, coniferous and deciduous. Mushrooms could be found among the firs and pines, but there were no berries, and the deciduous forest could only be entered for a few meters because further in was the impassable thicket, into which even the bravest hunters from their village were afraid to wade. After celebrating Emily's 13th birthday, Cindy went into town, leaving the girl food for a few days. Immediately after her departure, Emily began jumping and dancing in her room. A holiday is a holiday, and a child can rejoice even in the hardest of circumstances. While dancing, Emily accidentally tripped and caught her hand on a large ceramic pot on the table, which fell and shattered. "What have I done?" Emily screamed to herself. "All my food was in there." She was crying and wailing. Trying to calm herself, Emily stepped out onto the porch and thought. She did not want to live. She was afraid of starving to death and did not know what to do next. Her mind painted terrible pictures. Hunger, exhaustion, death. Emily went into the house and picked up the remains of food from the floor, which had no shards of broken pot. There was too little of it. The girl looked thoughtful at the broken pot and said aloud, "I will go for berries in the forest, in the thicket. I will be brave, strong, and mature." Suddenly, Emily wondered, feeling an inexplicable fear as if her mind were warning her of something. She remembered the talk of adults who told her that the forest was cursed, but fear of starvation and a sense of hopelessness overcame her fear of the strange forest. Emmy constructed a cloth berry bag from old, worn-out cloth and set out to fish. On her way, she met an older woman living on their village's outskirts. The older woman tried to stop Emily, shouting something after her, but the girl quickly ran away. She began to have a little fun. She almost ceased to be afraid of the scrub. At the entrance to the forest was not scared at all. Fragrant flowers were growing around, and in some places, there were blackberries. The forest seemed friendly, and there was nothing to be afraid of. The first thickets could be seen in front of her. The thick, intertwined branches of tall trees and impassable bushes blocked the way. It seemed like eternal night inside, and it was dark, smelling of moss and strangely cold. It seemed to Emily that the forested bowl was breathing, and this breath as if it said, "You are a stranger. Go away. You are not welcome here." Fear enveloped the girl. She stopped, frightened, and looked ahead. Strange feelings tore Emily. It seemed to her that the scrub a few meters away from her was deliberately instilling fear, but at the same time as that fear, something inside the dark forest beckoned her. Foreign voices began to appear in Emily's mind, whispering promises of many berries in the thicket, plenty of food, new clothes, and money. Emily crouched down on a dry tree that lay on the ground and tried to clear her thoughts. She was both scared and curious simultaneously. The shiver of fright and the anticipation of the joy that the thick, dark forest was full of berries and other gifts, because it was her birthday. Emily shuddered when she heard the crackling of twigs on the ground and footsteps approaching her. Someone was approaching quickly and breathing heavily. Emmy began to cry and shiver, not even realizing that the sound of footsteps was from the direction of the village, not from the thicket. An old grandmother from their town, who had tried to stop her as she entered the forest, came up to her. The older woman sat down next to the girl and told her that she had to get out of there as soon as possible and that she should not look deep into the thicket. Emily began to ask about the reasons for what was happening. The older woman began to tell her that many centuries ago, there was a small town where hunters and fishermen lived on the site of their village. People were wealthy. They developed trade. According to the legend, there was a lake behind the impenetrable forest, rich in fish, but now it was impossible to get to it. Emily listened to the older woman, trying to concentrate on what she was saying, but her mind was divided. The whispers of berries and riches inside the thicket wouldn't stop in her head. She was scared and didn't know what to do. The older woman kept talking. Emily remembered scraps of phrases and events. She kept wanting to turn around to look where the constant voices in her head beckoned her. The older woman told of a young woman who lived in the town and was considered a witch. As she grew older, wrinkles appeared on her face, causing her to begin hiding from the sun, thinking that the sun's rays were drying out her skin. Children, or 13 girls, began to go missing in their town, and she was disappearing on the 1st of August, which is precisely the day, Emmy, the old woman said in a whisper. Emily heard a gust of wind from the dense, dark woods and turned there. Behind the nearest dense bushes stood a girl. She waved at Emmy, laughed, and ran off. A whisper in her head begged her not to listen to the older woman, claiming that she was a witch who wanted Emily to starve to death. Fear bound the girl's body. She looked at the older woman with genuine terror, no longer understanding the meaning of her story. She wanted to scream and run forward to where the whispers came from, where it was nice and quiet. Emily stood up abruptly and ran into the darkness of the scary forest. She could no longer hear the cries of the older woman, who begged her to stop and not go deep into the thicket. The birds' chirping stopped abruptly, and there was a ringing silence all around, broken by the creaking of the trees and faint gusts of cold wind. Emmy woke up in pain, her hands and feet bleeding from the thorny, dry driftwood. She was lying on the damp, cold ground. It was dark, and the darkness seemed strange at noon. Above Emmy's head, the branches of the trees were woven into a dense carpet of wood that barely let the sun through. Part of the older woman's story about the village witch's fear of sunlight came to mind. Emily rose from the ground and saw a path of berries. There were dead trees riddled with corrosion, prickly bushes, cold and gloom, but right in front of her were berries. It looked like a path of vast amounts of strawberries and blackberries. A strange sound was heard next to Emily, as if someone was silently crying. She turned around, and animal fear gripped her body. Next to her were girls her age. Their faces were crying, but no sound could be heard, and their bodies were scarred and translucent. Then a whisper sounded in her head, offering to pick some berries, and the transparent weeping figures disappeared. Emmy's consciousness was divided. One part of her was terrified and wanted to go home, and the other part was wholly resigned to the voices in her head. The girl cautiously approached the path of berries. They were honest, juicy, and delicious. The fragrant strawberries and bright blueberries seemed like salvation. Emily was engrossed in berry picking and didn't notice how she came out into a strange clearing. It smelled musty and dead, and the grass was completely rotten. In the center of the clearing was a large rock, near which a black shadow flashed. Emmy dropped the bag of berries from her hands and froze. Scraps of the older woman's story flashed through her mind and seemed incredibly accurate. Emily's cold sweat and shivering all over her body spoke of too much fear, just the kind that interfered with her ability to think straight. Panic and despair gripped her, and she felt it grow colder, the trees creaking and howling. The black shadow slowly approached Emily. The girl cried and closed her eyes. Emily's body no longer obeyed her, surrendering to the shadow's power. She could smell death coming from the black entity, mingling with the smell of the fire. Emily's helpless body strolled toward the black stone, the trees creaking harder and louder. The shadow darted toward the rock, forcing Emily's body to lie in its center. Around it stood the transparent crying girls had seen the day before near the berry path. Emily's last memory was the intensifying smell of the fire and the terrible hopelessness in her thoughts, ultimately shrinking her consciousness. "My girl, please wake up!" Emily heard the voice of Cindy, her foster mother. She slowly opened her eyes, the smoke all around her and the campfire stench, the smell of which was the last thing on her mind. Emily was lying on her bed in Cindy's house, surrounded by the women of their village and the older woman who had tried to stop her from going into the scary woods the day before. The older woman sat down next to Emily and continued the story. That witch, afraid of sunlight, had disappeared from the village, and her house burned down. The 13-year-old girls continued to go missing every year on the same day, August 1st. They could not be found alive or dead. People were afraid and left town. Thus the area became deserted, and the forest became an impenetrable thicket, within which the spirit of the evil witch was hiding from the light and waiting for a new victim. The witch tried to regain her youth and life by using the souls of children growing up and eating their bodies, killing them on a black stone for sacrifices. After they died, the murdered girls became ghosts. The evil part of the forest would not let them go. The older woman specified that after Emmy had gone deep into the woods, she called the village men, and they threw burning torches on the woven dry crowns and set them on fire. As a result, the witch's black shadow disappeared because of the sunlight that hit her, and from the burning forest, the men were able to rescue the half-living Emily. No one ever heard of the witch again. The sinister part of the forest burned, opening a passage to the Great Lake and Berry Meadows. The village established a fishery, people had jobs, and Emily and Cindy never starved again.